Welcome to the Canny Conversations podcast, Conversations with a Cause with social entrepreneur Safaraz Ali.
Welcome to another Canny Conversation with a Cause, a conversation that we hope will captivate your curiosity cannily. And on this occasion, we're talking about communication. In fact, more specifically, we're talking about an element of communication, which is the spoken word. And to drill down a little bit further, we're talking about, more specifically, radio. We couldn't have somebody much better to join us today to talk about radio. Tony Adams. Tony is a journalist and a broadcaster, so a provider of radio. And Safaraz, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Very well.
It's lovely to see you, Saf. Of course, Saf, you are both a consumer and a provider, because obviously what we're doing now is a form of radio. So to start off, Saf, just tell us something about what kind of radio you listen to. How did you get into radio? When did you first start listening?
Yeah, I would say I'm a consumer first. I've been a consumer all my life, and radio's played a massive part in my life, in my upbringing. Starting from the days when I was listening to Radio WM, the Asian Network, a channel which is a local BBC channel, but they had certain sections in there, certain time frames where we had Asian music, which was a new thing for me at that time, and really listening to Radio 1 in my youth, Radio WM. Number of radio stations, really, to be frank with you. I've had periods where I've been listening to Radio 4 for about 2-3 years, Talk Radio, Virgin Radio, you name it, I've listened to quite a few.
So have you found that over the years your radio tastes have changed? Perhaps when you were younger, you listened to Radio 1 and you've kind of moved up the scale and Radio 2, and then how over the years has your...
I've flip-flopped a little bit. I mean, I would say I'm currently flicking through sort of smooth radio and local radio stations. I'm finding that local radio stations are giving me more value, particularly in terms of some of the things that you don't get from mainstream radio, mainstream TV, or mainstream media, local interviews, and local events. So I'm sort of focusing a little bit more on just the local radio at the moment. But I do go through various things. So in the morning I might listen to a little bit of LBC. So sometimes it depends on the presenter. So I've had a phase where Chris Evans, I was really into Chris Evans, Steve Wright in the afternoon, Nicky Campbell, and sort of these sort of big names really. And then locally, back in the day, Tony will probably remember Danny Churanji, DCS, and those sort of guys, and big sort of stars. And obviously we've got a massive star with us today, Tony Adams. Really appreciate you coming and supporting us, and been a big fan of your station. I've been luckily been on your channel a few times as well, so thank you for the opportunity.
Let's invite the gentleman you've been talking to join the conversation. Tony, how are you?
Yeah, very good morning, Adrian.
Good, excellent. Tony, tell us a little bit about your radio life. How did you start?
Oh, wow. A very good morning, Saf. Well, okay, so I landed at the BBC at the age of 18, going back in 87. What people may not know is I actually suffer from stuttering and stammering. So I'm a stammerer. Very, very short, just in 3 sentences, I ended up in what I would have thought was a British Telecom job at 18, 19. What it was actually was an 0898 premium line service, which was advertising various services. And at that time, the service was based around arranged marriages and just contacts around that industry. So where people could call in on a premium rate line, 35 people, blah, blah, blah. And we obviously get the compatibility. But the journey into radio, actually, Adrian, was when I went in for the interview. Here I am, a stutterer and stammerer, and I've been given a script, and my world was just almost at an end. I was told to go into a cubicle and read this script. I did. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, the red light came on in the studio, and I found my voice. And the rest is history.
So if you're an enormous believer in the power of can do, and isn't that a wonderful story about somebody who's got a stammer, basically earning their living by speaking? It's
Absolutely. When I first time I've heard that as well, Tony. I mean, thank you for sharing that with us. I've always regarded Tony as a professional. I've said that many times. And Tony, you are a professional, somebody that I look up to, and and I listen to, and I often go to for tips. And for you to share that with us, I think that's fantastic and inspiration for all of us.
Yes, and an inspiration for people that listen as well, because somebody out there with a stammer or some kind of challenge might think, well, I'd love to have a go at that, but I can't. And Tony's saying, actually, by demonstrating that you can. So, talking about radio, we communicate through all sorts of senses. We communicate visually, body language is very important. We communicate through touch. But I suppose that word speech is perhaps the biggest way in which we communicate, if you take writing out of the equation. What for you makes radio special, a bit different from the other means that we communicate with?
Okay. So in terms of the talk type based radio, when there's a conversation, I feel that's much more intimate. It feels like it's a one-to-one. You're more engaged, more listening, more attuned, and you're focused, traditionally focused. However, radio also gives you the ability, depending again on the station and what's going on, for you to do other things as well. So it could be background. I've had radio at work. So I used to be a security guard. And you're doing 12-hour shifts, and radio keeps you company throughout the night. It keeps you company on your 12-hour shift, and you can carry on, working, and you can carry on doing what you're doing, and it's there, and it keeps you company. So I've found radio as a mechanism to keep you company. It's obviously in some cases it's interviews or conversations, people coming on board, and it's a form of engagement. So for me, it's very intimate, but at the same time, it can be background in terms of carrying on with your other activities. So I flicker through both really.
Tony, what do you think makes radio a bit different?
I think it's an individual preference, isn't it? I mean, as Safaraz alluded to, I mean, you may have a certain taste of music of a certain genre. And of course, with radio, we've got just so much choice at the moment, haven't we? I come from a generation where I grew up with and listened to Steve Wright on Radio 1. It was a Steve Wright show. And then, of course, it was a Sunday chart show, which we used to record on cassette tapes and then listen back. But then, of course, over the years, as my journey into journalism went through, then of course Radio 4, it was the de facto platform where journalists not only compiled reports but listened to breaking stories as well. But me personally, I think over the years, again, I think I've definitely surfed different channels, and again, for me, it's more about local news. I think we've lost local news, or certainly that element in broadcasting, certainly in the radio industry. And that's now evolved, Adrian, because we have now what's called community radio stations, which is giving a complete different choice for the local communities. And again, very engaging. It's very, very informative, and it's very, very precise for that particular listener.
Have you taken part in phone-ins and that kind of thing on radio? Because one of the things that radio does do, which television really finds very difficult, is to actually directly engage with the listener. And the talk show on radio, there's plenty of them around, and they give people the opportunity to make a contribution. Is that something you've engaged with in the past, Steph? And what's your experience of some of the smaller radio stations, the community stations that Tony mentioned?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of community radio stations. I've Radio Ramadan, whenever that comes up, obviously in the period of Ramadan, I tend to switch over to that because that's very specialist, very niche. You know what you're getting into, and I think that's the key. In terms of community radio stations, Radio WM, definitely at a time when there's conversations going on about a Trojan horse, and I don't know Trojan horse is back in the news, but that was something that really got me going. and I did phone in, particularly because I was living in that area and I had a vested interest and I was engaged in that particular conversation. Other areas, in other occasions, I've had. Luckily, I've been invited to come in and say a few words, whether it's to do with enterprise business or BAME aspect of it, and I've utilised that opportunity. But yeah, definitely niche, local is something that I'm focused on. We've got we've got obviously BBC local news, but we've also got independents, and I think independents have a massive place. And then you've got all these community radio stations, hospital radio stations, and many others, which give the opportunity to individuals to come up into the role.
What's your approach to engagement, Tony? I mean, I know you have a daily program on Radio XL. I mean, how do you have people phone in and talk and just help us with how you sort of kind of control that? Because, people that come onto the radio phone in, they probably don't know the laws of libel. They don't know, perhaps always how to conduct themselves. There's always the people who want to ring every day, I guess. A lot of local radio tends to have a lot of regulars. So how do you control that to make sure that there's balance and everything is kept decent, honest and legal?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Libel laws are, as we all know, are so hard to protect and, of course, to go to court. And there's many lawyers I know who will just say, Tony, I'm sorry, it's not for us. It's interesting, Adrian, because the show I do on Radio XL, which is, by the way, an independent station, so it got its license back in 1995. It's been going around 26 years. Primarily a commercial radio station, so it's based obviously on money, on revenue. And I've been lucky to do both shows. The breakfast show, which, as we know in the industry, is the premium show. And then the drive time, excuse me, which I've been doing for a number of years. And certainly as a journalist, I think it definitely helps because if the show is as it is, it's infotainment, so breaking stories, music, of course, a balance of calls as well. And I suppose I have got the edge sitting there behind the microphone, knowing the laws. So it's actually knowing what you're going to be talking about, how you're going to be carrying on that discussion, and more importantly, steering the listener to making sure he or her or she is well within the realms of Ofcom regulations and broadcasting. So you've really got to be on your toes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just explore something with you because people may or may not know that as well as journalism, I've worked in the corporate world in some significant size companies. And one of the things that I learned very early on was for a chief executive of a big company, in some respects, the local radio telephone interview, the phoning program is the one they fear most in some respects, because a chief executive at one of the big water companies that I used to work for once said to me, if I've got a Radio 4 interview and I prepare properly and I can talk about the capital programme and the science of water and all the rest of it, that's not too bad. I can prepare for that, he said. What really gets me, what really worries me, is the local radio station where somebody rings up and says, why can't I get a decent cup of tea in Wednesbury because the water tastes so awful? So as a businessman, how do you feel about talking about your company and its services on radio? Is that something that you would have concerns about, or would you welcome it as an opportunity?
I remember, I think for over a period of 10 years, I was listening to Ed Doolan, BBC Radio WM. Tony will probably remember this as well. And on that show, it was a consumer affairs show, and you had Ed Doolan fighting for the rights of consumers, and he was getting on the phone to National Express, WM, Travel, the local water board, various other organisations, and I was a problem solver. And there was 2 or 3 people regularly used to come in. Phil Bates was one. We used to run. The bus service and a number of other people. And he was a consumer champion. And I regarded him as very high esteem. He was the guy that solved people's problems. And you are absolutely right. There's some people that wouldn't come on the station, but the power of that channel, the power of a champion. When you're in broadcast media, you're a journalist. You've got a certain amount of power that comes with that, and a certain amount of responsibility that comes with that as well. And when you're able to make the change that you can and influence, it's a big thing. And I think there's a responsibility that comes with it. And yes, sometimes the consumer is right. Sometimes they can go a little bit too much as well, because they think they've automatically deserved, and big business or business is always in the wrong. It's not the case. And people have this expectation that, if it's a consumer and it's a business is always wrong. That's not necessarily the case. And each case is different. But I think where the journalist and the broadcaster comes in is really trying to get that balance in. I do absolutely understand we can hit sometimes business a little bit too hard, but it's getting that balance right, understanding the picture, understanding the aspect of it. But from my perspective, I've had the opportunity to go on to Solihull radio station, talk about apprenticeships. I've had the opportunity to go on to stations, talk about the shortage in terms of staffing that businesses are facing. Care, we've got a care business as well that we're facing. I've also had an opportunity to talk about our Asian Apprenticeship Awards and our BAME Apprenticeship Awards. So it's a fantastic medium to go out there and get your message across. You're probably aware that my brother runs a small radio station as well, and he often talks about community affairs, local, whether it's a local fair at the park or those sort of things. And these conversations, most radio stations wouldn't be interested in.
Tony, I want to explore with you and Saf as well, the what I call the democratisation of radio, in the sense that, there are people who would not consider themselves to be very old, who would remember the time when, the choice was Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, or the Pirates. And now, of course, there are, I think it wouldn't be unfair to say, literally hundreds of radio stations. But I want to ask you, Tony, do you think that is entirely a good thing? Because what you tend to get, don't you, is segmentation. If you're interested in a particular topic, or you're from a particular community, you might listen to a particular station. Your station that you work on at the present time is aimed primarily at the Asian community. Do you think the danger with that is that people tend to create echo chambers? If you're interested in one particular topic, you just listen to one type of program, and therefore you don't get the broader mix of content that perhaps you got in to use an old-fashioned term, I might call the old days. And the other thing, which I'd like you both to talk about, is this proliferation of local radio at the expense of content? Because, to be perfectly honest, there are a lot of stations, talk stations, they're just desperate to fill. So they'll have anybody on talking at any level of rubbish. Sorry to use the term. So that's a very important point in terms of radio as an educator. So Tony, address that if you would.
Yeah, it's interesting, but let's not forget, we've had COVID for the last 2 years. So just to give you an example, and I think Saf has already alluded to a station that I actually set up with a very good friend of mine in the heart of Alum Rock, which is a really deprived, what people would call a deprived inner city area, Arbgy of ours. And the reason for that was because there was just so much going on, and because the mass information was so general, it wasn't penetrating what we would call the South Asian community. And of course, we know with the advent of all the research and of course whatever's happened through COVID, the Asian community was hit very hard with COVID-19. And this particular station was at the helm of providing a very invaluable service for that community, and has done, I think, over the last 2-3 years. So it's done immensely well. It's really hit the nail on the head. Where other stations, for example, BBC Local Radio, they were scattering around. Unfortunately, journalists were having to do some extensive work trying to get all the data, where these particular chaps knew exactly what was going on. They knew exactly how to engage with the local NHS workers and key workers workers and, of course, all the other service providers, and relay that information in 4 or 5 different languages, which I don't think a normal BBC local radio station could do. But it's interesting, hasn't it? How radio has evolved and how stations have evolved. I was actually speaking to our own CEO only a few days ago at Radio Excel. When Excel launched back in 2005, it was, wow, it's great, it's new, it's funky. But what's actually happened, Adrian, over the years, it's become an old gold station. So where kids were listening or in the teens and 20s, they've now got married, they've got kids of themselves. So really, it's a 3rd, 4th generation. Even my own children, they won't listen to me on Radio Excel. They said, no, your music doesn't taste it's not fit for purpose. So, and they'll listen to something else. You can't blame these kids, can you? You can't blame communities. So old gold, I think, is definitely is something we're going to be hearing more about.
Saf, too much choice, do you think?
Not necessarily. I think what you find is that the mainstream stations often are focused on the local stations because that's where they get their sort of breaking news. They get the insights in terms of what's going on. They've got to go and get news from somewhere. They've got to go and find opportunities to talk to people, and often it's these local community stations bring up the stars, bring up the issues, and then sort of filter upwards to a certain level. And as Tony's absolutely said, the local community stations did a fantastic job, phenomenal job over the period to get the information out there. And even the local BBC stations wouldn't have, or any other stations, because it's the local people getting the message out in a way that it's about trust at the end of the day. The people, local communities trust the local stations because they know who the presenters are, they know who the people are, they know who often the guests are, and you don't get that often with some of the other stations. But
so where did you get, when we were during the height of the COVID pandemic, and we're doing this broadcast, fingers crossed, when the situation has eased, where did you get your information from during the height of the COVID pandemic? Was it radio? Was it television? Was it newspapers? Was it chatting over the garden fence?
Well, it's a combination. I think it's a combination. I mean, if some of your contacts are professionals, they have sometimes inside information. We were in the education, we're in the education and the care sector, so we were getting bulletins from government as well directly, and getting emails in terms of updates on a regular basis because we were at the forefront. Home care, people providing care in the community was at the forefront. Education was also affected, adult education, classes, working with the job centres, unemployment. So we were lucky enough to have that regular updates on a daily basis, directly from government sources, local government associations, and local NHS trusts as well. So that was a key part of our information, but generally understanding what, my sort of close relatives and friends, most of them were getting their information from other people, and sometimes it was scaremongering. Unfortunately, sometimes it's from Facebook and sort of TikTok and various other people who are pretending to be, at the forefront of knowledge or information, and often it's just there to, it's just there to get sound bites and misinformation. So it's, so I had I think a dual role there to try and direct people back into a reliable source. And from my perspective, I can't direct them to Radio 4 or sort of the BBC. I've got to direct them to something which is more fit for purpose, and something which they can engage with and understand. And in some cases, it's the language barrier as well. With people. You've got to realise in some cases, some communities, and it's not just about the South Asian community. We've got a lot of these European communities in and around where we live, where they were getting information again from local stations who had sections in there for that particular community as well. Yeah,
I want you just to talk about one business, Saf, element of this, and then I'd like Tony to sort of share his thoughts, and that's about trust. We have all these radio stations. I mean, obviously, the BBC, and I think the BBC is a great institution. I make no bones about that. But the BBC and the big broadcasters are regulated, there is a requirement to for them to be balanced in terms of what they do. Do you worry, Saf, when you're listening to a commercial station that they are perhaps influenced by, the people that are paying the money, the sponsors, the advertisers? Do they have sometimes a vested interest to put a particular point of view? And do you also have concerns about independent and small stations in the sense that there might be a tendency to push a particular agenda and not be balanced? And if you could address that, Saf, and then Tony, you could come in and explain what sort of regulation applies to independent and community stations. But Saf, do you trust what you listen to on the smaller stations?
It depends on who it is as well, and it depends on the topic. I generally tend to trust the local stations because it is local. It's people that I know. The independence, from my perspective, I have no issues with, because it's very clear when there's an advert. It's very clear when it's the person talking, and it's very clear when there's a topic or conversation going on. And what I find is journalists and radio presenters make a big deal to try and remain independent and have that voice of reason and present the argument or the debate in both sides. I've listened to many stations where it's and particularly in terms of the Asian radio stations, where there's topics in terms of arranged marriage or various other things that are taking place, divorce, and there's so many taboo types of I'm taboo in sort of speech marks or quotation marks type topics that people get quite emotional. And what I find is from my perspective, the presenters are trying to get a balance right. In terms of self-interest, we've had, BBC has had mud thrown at it, a number of times. So, BBC, yes, we're all supporters of BBC here. I am as well, and I'm a big fan of BBC, and BBC has been a big part of my life. But we've seen the issues with the BBC itself. And that's not about advertising. It's about self-interest, and it's about people at the top who are looking after themselves and have a certain bias. If you talk to somebody from a particular party, they'll say, well, BBC supports the other party. You talk to the other party, they'll say they support the other party. So we've got, BBC is in a situation where, unfortunately, it's easy for us to throw mud at. So it's not necessarily the beacon to say this is a beacon of trust. It depends on the view, and we can debate about the BBC for forever and a day. So yes, we're big supporters of the BBC, and I said, BBC local station has played a big part of my life. BBC Radio 1, Radio 2, Steve Wright in the afternoon for me, Chris Evans as well in his day, even people who were originally in the pirate stations and moved over then to BBC, and yes, it's very valuable, and and I hope there's definitely a change that's needed, but I hope it doesn't go away. But in terms of your trust, I think just to say independents are more likely to go down a road of being biased, I don't agree with that at all.
I mean, I want to bring you, Tony, in on this one. I mean, as far as the BBC is concerned, I hear people say that the BBC is biased. I don't believe that. My criticism of the BBC is that people like Gary Lineker and, pop jockeys like Zoe Ball are earning a damn sight more money than, the men and women who are at the time of our broadcast, broadcasting from Kiev in the Ukraine, which seems a bit crazy to me. Tony, somebody once said that the BBC, if the BBC got an exclusive interview with God, they wouldn't be able to use it unless they could get in touch with the devil and allow him the right of reply. What regulation is there in the sort of stations that you work for in terms of having to be balanced?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we have the UK regulator, which is Ofcom, which governs broadcasting generally throughout the UK.
Just to interrupt, does Ofcom apply to community stations as well?
Absolutely. And then within the radio industry, we have the Radio Authority, who actually issue the licenses here in the UK. The spectrum for FM and AM licenses are almost now at a standstill. There won't be any more licenses issued. And hence why Ofcom is now trying to promote more community radio stations, which they do actually get, every sort of 6-7 months. But on the advent of that now, we're actually seeing smaller stations cropping up, which we call hyper-local radio stations, which effectively what RPQRs is in the heart of Alum Rock. But, the industry's changed, Adrian, for a number of years, and I'm quite privileged to say the best years of my broadcasting, certainly my journalism road, was within the BBC. No two ways about it. A great institution. However, is it fit for purpose in 2022 and beyond? And of course, we're now talking about the licence fees. I think it is value for money. Can we trust the BBC? Well, let's talk about the world population, the world service, for example, an invaluable service for expats all over the world, and they do tune into the world service. I think it's always going to be here. I don't think it's going to go. What does it mean for commercial stations? They've got to up their game, absolutely. Community stations will also need to look further afield. And it's interesting, isn't it, really? Even within the commercial radio sector, you're looking at the BBC almost touting for talent. In fact, they are now coming to the smaller stations and saying, Joe Dodd, you sound very good, but how would you like a gig at the BBC? And that's the way it's evolving. But I think, unfortunately, we've seen names like Steve Wright, like Zoe Ball, institutions for 20 years plus, and they seem to have gigs where black broadcasters, or certainly broadcasters from the Birmingham community, they hit a glass ceiling, and after 5 or 6 years, it's almost end of the road, unfortunately.
Do you, Saf, believe that there's... we are kind of starting to run out of time, but I think this is an important issue. Do you feel, Saf, as somebody, as a British Asian, do you think there is enough radio out there for people from different ethnic backgrounds?
Tony and I were having a discussion earlier on today, and I find it very difficult to come up with more than 2 or 3 names of Asian. If I talk about Asian radio presenters who are at the standard of, say, in my eyes, from a personal perspective, at a sort of a national, international BBC standard, there's not many. And it's not because there's lack of talent, it's just the fact that they've not had the opportunity, there's no mechanism for them to go through. I think BBC has particularly a responsibility, because of the institution that it is, to bring more people through to the foray. I mean, we've had issues in the past where the local BBC Asian station was at risk of being closed down as well, and we all got together. I signed the petition myself because I thought, that's a big loss of an opportunity there, and it has a role. Obviously, the independents have a role, but BBC has an extra responsibility, more so, I think, than anybody else, because of the way it is funded and the way it is in our society. But yes, there's a handful. There's just not enough. I can't think of any real names, and whenever you think about radio presenters, you unfortunately keep going back to presenters from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 25 years ago. It's the Steve Wrights in the afternoon. It's all these the big players. Emily Matus has gone on to LBC. It's all those sort of players that are there because they attract people, they recognise names, but you have to give the opportunity to new talent. Fresh talent, and it's not always about young talent as well. It's about people who have effective contribution that they can bring in.
I did some notes for this broadcast, and there are so many topics that we've touched on, and there's a lot of topics that we could have talked about that we just don't have time. Saf, I think we'd like to give a sort of last word to Tony on this particular one. Tony, I just want you to. And of course, we've talked about Steve Wright in the afternoon. What about Tony Adams in the afternoon on Radio XL? Tony, just in 30 seconds, if you can, what's the future for radio?
I think radio is instilled in British society, certainly in the UK. I think it's here to stay. I think radio is so receptive. It's an instant medium. It's a great channel of passing that information. And I think, honestly, it's looking very rosy. In fact, if we look at the radar figures, which is actually produced by Ofcom, the listenership during COVID has probably seen the highest at its peak over the last 4 to 5 years. So radio has played a pivotal role. I think it'll continue to do so. And I think we're just generally, I think we're spoiled for choice at the moment.
Saf, I'm sure we'd like to thank Tony, wouldn't we, for a very insightful and I suppose we almost leave with more questions than answers, but it's been great, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Tony's taken us down memory lane. We've had a fantastic conversation. And again, thank you, Tony, for all your support.
I hope that our listeners agree that we've had a fantastic conversation. And if that is the case, I hope that they will like, subscribe, and also give us your feedback, because, an important part of communication is hearing what the listener thinks of what we're doing. So thank you for everybody for listening. Time has caught up with us again. We're going to bring this canny conversation with a cause to a close. Stay safe till next time. Bye-bye.